My husband had no idea I understood Italian when he told his client I was too simple to comprehend his world, that I was basically decorative furniture in our Beacon Hill townhouse, and that he'd been moving our money offshore while sleeping with someone named Tiffany from his office. I'm Amanda. For over a decade, I thought I had a solid marriage in Boston. My husband Brandon was a senior manager at a tech giant downtown. I worked in marketing at a smaller firm. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Or so I believed until the distance between us became a canyon I couldn't cross anymore. He was always busy, always tired, and I became invisible in my own home. About a year ago, I started learning Italian. It was something I'd dreamed about since college, but I never told Brandon. He had this way of dismissing my interests, calling them cute or pointless. So Italian became my secret. I got fluent enough to understand movies, news, complex conversations. Then came the dinner invitation. Brandon needed me at a business dinner with an important Italian client, Mr. Rossi. I should smile, be pleasant, wear the navy dress. Mr. Rossi didn't speak much English, so Brandon would handle the talking. That's when everything changed. This is a long story about what happens when someone underestimates you in a language they think you don't understand. If you want to know how I turned my husband's arrogance into his downfall, stick around for what comes next. You can follow along here so you don't miss how this all plays out. The first crack in my marriage didn't happen overnight. It was more like watching a wall slowly develop a spiderweb of fractures you pretend not to see. 2 years ago, Brandon started staying late at the office. 3 nights a week became 4, then 5. Weekend mornings that used to mean pancakes and coffee in bed turned into him checking his phone with that distant look, like I was an interruption to something more important. When I'd ask about his day, I got one-word answers. When I'd share something from work, he'd nod without looking up. The worst part wasn't the loneliness. It was the gaslighting. When I mentioned feeling disconnected, he'd tell me I was being dramatic. When I suggested couples therapy, he laughed and said I watched too many TV shows. He made me feel like my concerns were symptoms of me being needy, not signs of something broken between us. That's when I found the language app on my phone while scrolling through mindless downloads one Tuesday night. Learn Italian in 30 days. I'd minored in Romance languages in college, had always wanted to visit Rome, Florence, the Amalfi Coast. Brandon used to promise we'd go someday. That promise, like many others, had evaporated. I downloaded it out of spite at first, something that was mine. Something he couldn't diminish because he wouldn't even know about it. The first lessons were basic. Greetings, numbers, food vocabulary. But I fell into it like someone falls into cold water on a hot day. It was refreshing. It made me feel like I still had a brain, still had curiosity, still existed as more than Brandon's convenient wife. Within 3 months, I'd moved past the app. I hired online tutors, had conversations twice a week with a woman named Francesca from Milan who told me about her bakery and asked about my life. I told her things I couldn't tell anyone else. How lonely I was. How small I felt. She never judged, just corrected my verb conjugations and taught me idioms. I practiced while Brandon slept. I listened to Italian podcasts during my commute. I watched films without subtitles. And I got good. Really good. Good enough that when Brandon came home one evening talking about his new Italian client and how crucial this relationship was for his promotion, I felt a strange flutter in my stomach. He paced our kitchen, loosening his tie, explaining how Mr. Rossi was old school, valued family men, wanted to see stability before committing to a major contract. Brandon needed to bring me to dinner. Show me off like a prize at a county fair. He didn't ask if I wanted to go. He told me I was going, told me what to wear, told me to smile and be charming and not talk too much about work because Mr. Rossi wouldn't be interested. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like I was a prop, like my only value was decorative. I agreed, but something shifted in me that night. For the first time in 2 years, I felt a spark of something that wasn't sadness or resignation. It was curiosity mixed with something darker. A whisper in the back of my mind, wondering what Brandon said about me when he thought no one was listening. The dinner was set for Thursday night at an upscale restaurant in the North End. Brandon reminded me 3 times to wear the navy dress, the one that made me look professional but not threatening. His words, not mine. I spent Wednesday night rehearsing in my head, not Italian phrases, but the performance I'd need to give. The dutiful wife, The woman who didn't understand the men's conversation. The woman who was exactly as simple as Brandon apparently believed I was. Thursday arrived with cold October rain beating against our windows. I dressed carefully, applied makeup with steady hands, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back looked polished, composed, unremarkable. Perfect. Brandon barely glanced at me when I came downstairs. He was on his phone, texting rapidly. As we drove to the North End, he coached me. Don't interrupt. Don't order anything too expensive. Laugh at Mr. Rossi's jokes even if I don't understand them. Be pleasant. I wondered when I'd stopped being his wife and become his employee. The restaurant was everything Brandon promised. Candlelight, white tablecloths, Italian opera playing softly in the background. Mr. Rossi was already seated, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes. He stood when we arrived, shook Brandon's hand, then took mine and pressed his lips to my knuckles in that old-world way. He greeted us in Italian. My heart started racing. Brandon responded fluently. I'd had no idea he spoke Italian. In 10 years of marriage, he'd never mentioned it. Not once. Another secret, another part of himself he'd kept locked away from me. I smiled and said nothing, exactly as instructed, and that's when I realized this dinner was going to change everything. The waiter brought menus in Italian. I pretended to study mine cluelessly, while Brandon ordered for both of us without asking what I wanted. He chose the cheapest pasta on the menu for me, and the osso buco for himself. Mr. Rossi noticed, I could tell by the slight raise of his eyebrow, but said nothing. The conversation started pleasantly enough. They discussed Boston, the weather, the restaurant. Brandon's Italian was good, but not perfect. He made small grammatical errors, used formal constructions when casual ones would flow better. Mr. Rossi was gracious, never correcting him. I sipped my water and played with my napkin, the picture of a bored wife at a business dinner. Then Mr. Rossi asked about me, how we met, how long we'd been married, what I did for work. My throat tightened. This was the moment. Brandon answered in Italian. He told Mr. Rossi we met in college, had been married 11 years, that I worked in marketing, but nothing too demanding. The way he phrased it made my job sound like a hobby, like I volunteered at a gift shop on weekends. Mr. Rossi smiled at me and said in Italian that I seemed lovely, asking if I enjoyed my work. Brandon answered before I could even pretend not to understand. He said I enjoyed it fine, that it kept me busy, that I wasn't particularly ambitious, but that was okay because it meant I could focus on our home. I dug my fingernails into my palm under the table. The appetizers arrived, bruschetta, calamari, a burrata that looked like a cloud. Brandon and Mr. Rossi continued talking business, contract terms, delivery schedules, profit margins. I ate slowly, carefully, keeping my face neutral while my brain processed every word they exchanged. That's when the conversation shifted. Mr. Rossi commented that Brandon was fortunate to have such a beautiful and supportive wife. He said it with genuine warmth. I could hear in his tone that he meant it as a compliment to both of us. Brandon laughed. Not a polite laugh, a knowing, cynical laugh that made the hair on my arms stand up. He said yes, I was beautiful and supportive. But to be completely honest, I was also very simple. Those were his exact words in Italian. Molto semplice. He took a drink of his Barolo and continued as if discussing the weather. I didn't understand his world, didn't understand business, didn't ask difficult questions. I was perfect for appearances. I kept the house nice. I smiled at the right times. I was essentially decorative. I reached for my wine glass with a hand that didn't shake only because I willed it not to. Mr. Rossi's expression changed slightly. The warmth cooled. He said something polite about how every successful man needs a peaceful home. He was trying to change the subject. I could feel it. Brandon didn't take the hint. Maybe he was emboldened by the wine. Maybe he'd been waiting to say these things to someone who would understand. He leaned back in his chair with this satisfied look and said the marriage worked well for him because it gave him freedom. That word. Libertà. Freedom. He said he'd been moving assets to offshore accounts, preparing the groundwork for something, though he didn't specify what. And then, as casually as someone discussing their golf game, he mentioned Tiffany. My vision blurred for a second. I blinked hard, forcing focus. Tiffany from the finance department. They'd been together for 6 months. She was ambitious, understood the game, knew how to navigate corporate politics. Everything I apparently wasn't. Brandon said Tiffany got his drive in a way I never could. He actually used the phrase, lives in la la land, to describe me. In Italian, it was vive nel mondo delle fate, lives in the world of fairies. Mr. Rossi had stopped eating. He set down his fork carefully and asked Brandon, in a tone that had lost all friendliness, if he was sure this was appropriate dinner conversation. Brandon waved a hand dismissively. He said Mr. Rossi seemed like a man who understood how the world really worked, that successful men made difficult choices, that sometimes you had to separate personal life from business interests. He was practically bragging now, treating his betrayal of me like a smart financial strategy. I cut my pasta into smaller and smaller pieces, the knife scraping against the plate. The sound seemed deafening to me, but neither of them noticed. Mr. Rossi changed the subject firmly, asking about timeline for the contract. Brandon snapped back into business mode, pitching and persuading. I excused myself to the restroom. In the bathroom, I locked myself in a stall and stood there breathing slowly. In through my nose, out through my mouth. My reflection in the mirror afterward looked the same as it had an hour ago, but everything was different now. I knew. I knew about Tiffany. I knew about the offshore accounts. I knew exactly what my husband thought of me. I reapplied my lipstick with a steady hand and walked back to the table. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Dessert, espresso, more false pleasantries. Brandon was in high spirits, confident the deal was sealed. Mr. Rossi was polite but distant. When we said goodbye, Mr. Rossi took my hand again and held it just a moment longer than necessary. Our eyes met, and I saw something there. Recognition, maybe. Or pity. In the car ride home, Brandon talked about how well it had gone, how Mr. Rossi would definitely sign. I made agreeing noises. When we got home, he poured himself a scotch and went to his office to send follow-up emails. I sat on our couch in the dark and stared at nothing. Then I picked up my phone and texted my friend Heather. Just 2 words. Need help. Heather called me at 7 the next morning. She's one of those people who understands urgency without needing explanations. We'd been friends since college, had stayed close even though our lives had taken different paths. She went to law school and now worked at a firm that specialized in family law and white-collar crime. I'd always joked that I'd never need her services. I wasn't joking anymore. We met for coffee at a place in Cambridge, far enough from our neighborhood that I wouldn't risk running into anyone who knew Brandon. I told her everything. The Italian lessons, the dinner, every word Brandon had said. I could barely get through the part about Tiffany without my voice breaking. Heather didn't waste time on sympathy. She pulled out a legal pad and started taking notes. She asked precise questions. How long had I known about the affair? Did I have proof? What did I know about the offshore accounts? Where did Brandon keep his financial documents? I felt something shift inside me as I answered. The shock and hurt were still there, but underneath grew something harder, something calculating. Heather outlined the situation clinically. If Brandon was moving marital assets offshore without my knowledge, that was illegal. If he was planning to divorce me and hide money, I needed to act first. She asked if I wanted to save the marriage. The question hung in the air. Did I? I thought about the man who'd dismissed my career as a hobby, who'd called me simple and decorative, who'd treated our marriage vows like a business arrangement that could be terminated when convenient, who'd been sleeping with someone else while I lay awake at night wondering what I'd done wrong. I told Heather no. I didn't want to save it. I wanted to end it on my terms. She nodded and said we needed documentation. Bank statements, account numbers, emails, anything that proved the offshore transfers. Also, anything that confirmed the affair with Tiffany. The more ammunition I had, the better the divorce settlement would be. And if the fraud was serious enough, Brandon could face legal consequences beyond just losing half our assets. The problem was accessing his documents. Brandon had a home office he kept locked when he wasn't in it. He had a laptop with a password I didn't know. His phone was always in his pocket or in his hand. But I had advantages he didn't know about. I knew his patterns. Every Sunday morning, he went for a run through the common and the public garden. A full hour. His phone stayed home charging. His office key was on his running keychain, but there was a spare in the kitchen junk drawer underneath old takeout menus. That Sunday, I waited until I heard the front door close behind him. Then I moved fast. His office was exactly what you'd expect from Brandon. Minimalist desk, expensive chair, framed degrees on the wall. A filing cabinet with a lock that I managed to pick using a tutorial I'd watched on YouTube at 3 in the morning. My hands shook so badly it took 3 tries. Inside were folders meticulously labeled: tax returns, mortgage documents, investment portfolios. And then, in the back, a folder marked Cayman. My heart stopped. I pulled it out and started photographing every page with my phone. Account statements showing transfers of $75,000 over the past 8 months. Authorization forms in Brandon's handwriting. Correspondence with a bank I'd never heard of. He'd been systematic about it. Small transfers that wouldn't trigger automatic reporting requirements. Smart enough to be criminal. The folder behind it was labeled TM. I didn't need to guess what that meant. Inside were printed emails. Brandon and Tiffany discussing the affair with shocking casualness. Making plans. Sharing inside jokes. There was a reservation confirmation for a weekend they'd spent at a boutique hotel in Newport, while I thought Brandon was at a conference in Chicago. They'd booked the room under her last name. Mitchell, Tiffany Mitchell. I photographed everything. My hands steadier now. I was operating on pure adrenaline. His laptop was still locked, but I found a password notebook in his top drawer. Brandon was meticulous about security in some ways, and careless in others. The notebook had everything. Email passwords, bank logins, even the code to his office building's back entrance. I logged into his personal email account and scrolled through months of messages. There were more emails with Tiffany than I could count. Hundreds. They'd been planning this for longer than 6 months. More like a year. Maybe longer. One email from 3 months ago made me physically sick. Tiffany had asked when he was finally going to leave me. Brandon had responded that he needed to secure the finances first, make sure I couldn't touch his retirement accounts or the investments. He called me a liability that he'd been too patient with already. He said once everything was properly hidden, he'd file for divorce and claim irreconcilable differences. His lawyer had advised him to wait until after his next promotion, so the alimony calculation would be based on his old salary. They were plotting my financial destruction like it was a business strategy. I found the promotion email in his work inbox. It had come through 3 weeks ago. Senior director, $60,000 more a year. He hadn't told me. I saved everything to a secure cloud drive Heather had set up for me. 20 minutes before Brandon was due back, I closed everything, locked everything, put everything back exactly as I'd found it. When he came home sweating and cheerful from his run, I was making coffee like I did every Sunday morning. He kissed the top of my head absent-mindedly and headed for the shower. I stared at the coffee pot and realized my hands weren't shaking anymore. That afternoon, I emailed everything to Heather's secure client portal. She called me 2 hours later, Eview. Her voice was tight with controlled fury when she said I had more than enough for a divorce that would destroy him financially. But more importantly, I had evidence of wire fraud, tax evasion, and possibly money laundering. She had contacts at the Financial Crimes Division. Did I want to pursue criminal charges? I thought about Brandon calling me decorative. About Tiffany asking when he'd finally leave the dead weight behind. About 11 years of my life built on lies. I told Heather to pursue everything. Then I went upstairs and acted like nothing had changed. That was the hardest part. Smiling at him during dinner, asking about his day. Pretending I didn't know that every word out of his mouth was calculated to keep me stupid and compliant while he dismantled my life piece by piece. But I could pretend. I'd been pretending I had a real marriage for 2 years. A few more weeks wouldn't kill me. Heather moved faster than I expected. Within 3 days, she'd consulted with a forensic accountant who confirmed the offshore accounts constituted serious financial fraud. She'd also reached out to a contact at Brandon's company, someone in HR who'd apparently been waiting for evidence against him for years. Turned out Brandon had a reputation for being brilliant, but ruthless. The kind of manager who took credit for subordinates' work and threw colleagues under the bus to protect himself. People didn't like him. They were just afraid of him. Not anymore. The HR contact, a woman named Patricia who spoke to Heather off the record, had her own suspicions about Brandon and Tiffany. Relationships between managers and direct reports were against company policy. But without proof, she couldn't do anything. The emails I'd found changed that equation. Patricia also mentioned something else. Brandon had been under investigation for inflating performance metrics on the Italian contract. The deal with Mr. Rossi that he'd been so confident about, he'd been misrepresenting the profit margins to senior leadership, making it look more lucrative than it actually was to justify his promotion. If Mr. Rossi knew the real numbers, he'd walk away. That information sat in my brain like a puzzle piece I hadn't known I needed. Meanwhile, I kept playing the dutiful wife. Brandon had no idea I was documenting everything. I started a journal, recording his absences, his lies, his phone calls with Tiffany when he thought I was asleep. I noted every time he came home late smelling like perfume that wasn't mine, every time he showered immediately after walking in the door, every time he deleted his text messages while sitting at the dinner table. The hardest part was watching him be kind sometimes. He'd bring home flowers randomly, take me to dinner at a nice restaurant, ask about my day with what sounded like genuine interest. At first, I thought maybe he was feeling guilty. Then I realized the truth was worse. He was maintaining the illusion, keeping me satisfied enough that I wouldn't ask questions, like a zookeeper keeping an animal docile. 2 weeks after the dinner with Mr. Rossi, Brandon came home excited about a follow-up meeting. Mr. Rossi wanted to discuss final contract terms in person. This time, no spouses, just business. I remember the relief on Brandon's face when he said I didn't have to come. Like I'd been a burden he was grateful to shed. I told him that was fine. I had a marketing presentation to prepare anyway. He kissed my forehead and said I was the best. I wondered if he'd practiced that line with Tiffany, or if lying to me just came naturally now. The day of Brandon's meeting with Mr. Rossi, Heather called me. She'd finished building the legal case. The divorce papers were ready. More importantly, she'd compiled all the financial evidence into a report and sent copies to Brandon's company compliance department, the IRS, and the Massachusetts Attorney General's office. She asked if I was sure I wanted to do this. Once we filed, there was no going back. Brandon would know everything. He'd know I'd been investigating him. He'd know about the evidence. He'd know I understood Italian and had heard every word he'd said that night. My mouth went dry. This was the moment. The point where I stopped being a victim and became something else entirely. I told her I was sure. Heather said she'd have the papers served to him at his office tomorrow afternoon. Publicly, professionally, in front of his colleagues and Tiffany. Then she mentioned one more thing. She'd taken the liberty of reaching out to Mr. Rossi's lawyer in Italy, not to share privileged information, but to suggest Mr. Rossi might want to verify certain financial projections before finalizing any contracts with Brandon's company. I asked her why she'd done that. She said because men like Brandon don't just betray their wives. They betray everyone who's foolish enough to trust them. And Mr. Rossi had seemed kind to her when she'd briefly met him during the legal research phase. He deserved to know who he was doing business with. That night, Brandon came home later than usual. He'd stopped at a bar after the meeting, he said, to celebrate. Mr. Rossi was signing the contract next week. Everything Brandon had worked for was finally paying off. He opened a bottle of champagne, poured 2 glasses, toasted to his success. I clinked my glass against his and took a sip. He had no idea it was the last time we'd share anything. The next morning, I told Brandon I had a dentist appointment and would work from home afterward. He barely listened, already on his phone dealing with some crisis at the office. I didn't have a dentist appointment. I had a meeting with Heather to sign final documents and go over the plan for what would happen after the papers were served. She walked me through the timeline. Brandon would be served at 2 p.m. By 3, the compliance department would call him for an emergency meeting. By 4, his accounts would be frozen pending investigation. By 5, HR would inform him he was on immediate administrative leave. I asked what would happen to Tiffany. Heather smiled grimly. Tiffany would be fired for violating the relationship policy and for potentially being complicit in the financial fraud. The emails made clear she'd known about the offshore accounts. At exactly 2:15 p.m., my phone rang. Brandon. I didn't answer. He called again and again, 5 times in 10 minutes. Then came the text. What the fuck did you do? I stared at those words for a long time. The capital letters, the fury, the complete absence of remorse or self-awareness. I typed back just 3 words. What I had to. Then I blocked his number. Heather called at 3:30. Everything was proceeding as planned. Brandon had tried to call her office, yelling about illegal searches and privacy violations. She'd calmly explained that I, as his spouse, had legal access to marital property and documents. There was no illegal search, just a wife who'd been paying attention. At 5 p.m., I got a call from an unknown number. I answered. It was Mr. Rossi. His voice was formal, but not unkind. He said he'd received some concerning information about Brandon's business practices and wanted to verify whether I'd been aware of the misrepresentations in the contract proposals. I took a breath and answered him in Italian. I told him I'd known nothing about Brandon's business until the night of our dinner. that I'd understood every word Brandon had said, that I was sorry Mr. Rossi had been caught in my husband's web of deception. There was a long silence. Then Mr. Rossi said something I'll never forget. He said he'd suspected, that night at dinner, that I understood more than I let on. He'd seen something in my eyes when Brandon had been particularly cruel. He'd hoped he was wrong, hoped Brandon was simply awkward rather than malicious. He apologized for not speaking up. I told him there was nothing to apologize for, that I'd made my own choices about when and how to act. He asked if I would be all right. I surprised myself by saying yes. I actually would be. Brandon didn't come home that night, or the next. I changed the locks on our townhouse the first morning, another item on Heather's strategic checklist. A locksmith arrived at 8 a.m. with a court order authorizing the change. Technically, the house was marital property, but given the evidence of fraud and the restraining order Heather had secured, the judge agreed I needed security. Brandon's first attempt to get in came at 11 p.m. the second day. I watched from the upstairs window as he fumbled with his key, confused when it wouldn't turn. He pounded on the door, yelled my name, threatened to call the police. I called them first. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes. They explained the restraining order to Brandon calmly while he ranted about his own house and his rights. They gave him 15 minutes to collect essential items under their supervision. Clothes, toiletries, his laptop. He tried to go into his office. One of the officers stopped him. All financial documents were tagged as evidence in the ongoing fraud investigation. He couldn't touch them. The look on Brandon's face at that moment was almost worth the previous 11 years. He left with a duffel bag and murder in his eyes, shouting that I'd regret this, that I'd destroyed his life over nothing, that he'd make sure I ended up with nothing in the divorce. The police officer who stayed behind to file the incident report asked if I felt safe. I told her I did. She gave me her card anyway and said to call if he tried to contact me. He tried, constantly. Despite the restraining order, the messages flooded in from new numbers, from email accounts I didn't recognize, from social media profiles he created just to reach me. They followed a predictable pattern. Anger first, threats about lawyers and countersuits, and how I'd forged evidence. Then bargaining, promises to end things with Tiffany, to bring the money back, to go to counseling. Finally, when none of that worked, the attacks. Calling me vindictive, psychotic, a gold digger who'd never loved him and had just been waiting for an opportunity to cash out. I forwarded everything to Heather. She added it all to the file. His company moved fast. The compliance investigation took less than a week to confirm what my photos had shown. $75,000 in offshore accounts, unreported income, fraudulent expense reports dating back 3 years. They terminated him immediately and filed their own criminal complaint. His reputation in the tech industry was finished. Word traveled fast in those circles. Tiffany tried to play innocent. She claimed she'd known nothing about the financial fraud, that Brandon had manipulated her too. But the emails I'd found destroyed that defense. She'd helped him research offshore banking laws. She'd suggested the Cayman Islands specifically. She'd even joked in one message about how oblivious I was. She lost her job the same week. Last I heard, she was working retail in a mall in Braintree, a spectacular fall from her previous role managing multi-million-dollar accounts. Mr. Rossi pulled out of the contract entirely, not because of the financial misrepresentations alone, though those were damning enough, but because he told his lawyer, who told Heather, who told me, that he couldn't do business with a company that would employ someone who spoke about his wife with such contempt. Character mattered to him. Brandon had shown his. Brandon's lawyer tried to fight the divorce settlement, argued I wasn't entitled to half of assets I'd helped hide. Heather laughed in the deposition. She presented the timeline showing I discovered the fraud only weeks before filing. The judge agreed. Not only was I entitled to half of everything, but Brandon's attempt to hide assets meant I was entitled to more. We settled 2 months later. I got the house. I got 60% of our liquid assets. I got his retirement account. He got to avoid criminal prosecution if he repaid the offshore money and accepted a 5-year probation. His parents called me once. His mother crying, asking how I could be so cruel to their son over a simple mistake. I told her in careful, measured words that her son's mistake was getting caught. Then I hung up. Through all of this, I kept working. Kept going to my unimportant marketing job that Brandon had dismissed so easily. My boss had noticed something different in me. A confidence, maybe. A sharpness. She promoted me to senior coordinator and gave me the tech industry accounts. I poured myself into work. It was easier than thinking about the divorce, the betrayal, the ways Brandon had systematically tried to erase my value as a human being. Then, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was in Italian. Une opportunità. An opportunity. I opened it. Mr. Rossi had written to me personally. He said his company was expanding into the American market and needed someone to lead the marketing division for the new branch. Someone who understood both languages, both cultures, and who had proven discretion and intelligence. He'd seen my LinkedIn profile, reviewed my portfolio, and spoken to my current employer. The salary he offered was triple what I was making. The role was based in Boston, but would require quarterly trips to Italy. He ended the email by saying he believed in second chances and new beginnings. Not for people like Brandon, who squandered what they had, but for people like me, who'd had the courage to rebuild. I read the email 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time in Italian, just to make sure I understood every nuance. I did. I met Mr. Rossi at the same restaurant in the North End where everything had started. Different circumstances this time, different purpose. He arrived exactly on time, dressed in an immaculate suit. When I stood to greet him, I spoke in Italian, thanked him for the opportunity to meet, told him I was honored by his offer. His face broke into a warm smile. He said he'd known from that first dinner that I understood everything. The way I'd held my wine glass, the tension in my shoulders, the moment my eyes had flickered when Brandon said I was simple. He'd gone home that night troubled. He'd built his company on principles of respect and integrity. The idea of rewarding Brandon's contract had felt wrong. So he'd done what he always did when something felt wrong. He investigated. He'd had his lawyers pull records on Brandon's company, verify the financial projections, check references. What they'd found hadn't matched Brandon's promises. The profit margins were inflated. The timeline was unrealistic. The whole deal had been built on exaggerations and outright lies. Then my lawyer had reached out, and the pieces had fallen into place. Mr. Rossi said he'd canceled the contract not because of the personal drama, though Brandon's character had certainly been a factor. He'd canceled it because Brandon was fundamentally untrustworthy. In business, in marriage, in every aspect of his life. I asked why he was offering me the position. He leaned back and considered the question. Then he said something that made my throat tight. He said that in his 50 years of business, he'd learned the most dangerous people were those who underestimated others. They missed opportunities. They made enemies. They built houses on sand. Brandon had underestimated me completely, had assumed I was too simple to learn Italian, too passive to investigate, too scared to act. Every one of those assumptions had been wrong. That kind of miscalculation, Mr. Rossi said, was instructive. It showed what happened when you dismissed someone's potential based on your own limited imagination. He'd seen something else at that dinner, too. Resilience, control, the ability to maintain composure under devastating circumstances. Those were rare qualities, marketable qualities. His new American division needed someone who could navigate complex cultural dynamics, someone who understood how to read people, how to identify deception, how to build trust with clients, someone who'd proven they could handle pressure with grace. I realized he wasn't offering me a job out of pity. He was offering it because I'd earned it. I accepted. We discussed logistics, timelines, contracts. My role would involve developing the entire marketing strategy for the U.S. branch, hiring a team, establishing partnerships with American tech companies. Exactly the kind of ambitious, strategic work Brandon had claimed I wasn't capable of understanding. Mr. Rossi asked if I had any questions. I had one. I asked him why he'd kissed my hand at the end of that first dinner. It had seemed like more than just old-world courtesy. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said it was an apology for not speaking up when Brandon had degraded me, for letting politeness override his conscience. He'd regretted it immediately. I told him I understood, that sometimes we can't speak in the moment, that sometimes we have to choose our battles. He nodded. Then he said something in Italian that I'll carry with me forever. La pazienza è l'arma dei forti. Patience is the weapon of the strong. We finished our meal talking about Italy, about Boston, about the future. It felt surreal to be sitting in the same restaurant where my marriage had effectively ended, now discussing the beginning of a career I'd never imagined possible. As we left, I noticed someone across the street. Brandon. He was standing in the shadows outside a closed storefront, watching the restaurant, watching me. Even from a distance, I could see the rage in his posture. Mr. Rossi noticed my expression and followed my gaze. He frowned and asked if that was Brandon. I said yes. Mr. Rossi made a phone call in rapid Italian. Within minutes, 2 security personnel appeared from somewhere I couldn't identify. They approached Brandon, spoke to him briefly, and escorted him away. Mr. Rossi explained calmly that his company took security seriously, particularly for its employees. He'd already arranged for security measures at my home and office given the restraining order situation. I shouldn't worry about Brandon showing up uninvited. I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been holding. For the first time in months, I felt protected. Mr. Rossi walked me to my car. As I unlocked the door, he said one more thing. He said that Brandon would eventually move on, find new victims, rebuild his life somewhere else. Men like him always did. But I wouldn't just move on, I would transform. That was the difference between people who learned from betrayal and people who just repeated patterns. I drove home through Boston streets thinking about transformation, about the woman I'd been a year ago who'd started learning Italian out of loneliness, about the woman I'd been 6 months ago who'd sat at a dinner table and heard her worth calculated and dismissed, about the woman I was now, driving home from a job offer that would change my life. None of those women were weak. They were all versions of someone learning to fight. I started the new position on a cold Monday in February. Mr. Rossi's company had leased office space in the Seaport District, all glass and light and modern design. My office overlooked the harbor. I could see ships coming and going, carrying goods and people between continents. The first month was overwhelming in the best possible way. I hired a team of 6, built relationships with vendors, developed campaign strategies for the U.S. market launch. Every day brought new challenges, new problems to solve, new ways to prove to myself that I belonged in this world Brandon had said I couldn't comprehend. My Italian got even better. Daily calls with the Milan office, quarterly trips to meet with Mr. Rossi and the executive team. I'd walk through Florence discussing brand positioning, sit in Roman cafes reviewing market research. The language that had started as a secret garden became the foundation of my professional life. People at the company treated me with respect, not because I was a novelty or because they pitied my divorce story, but because I was good at my job, because I delivered results, because I understood how to connect Italian craftsmanship traditions with American consumer psychology. Mr. Rossi checked in occasionally, always professional but warm. He'd ask about my team's progress, offer insights, but never micromanage. Once, after a particularly successful campaign launch, he sent a handwritten note in Italian saying he'd been right about me, that patience was indeed the weapon of the strong. I framed it and put it on my desk. Brandon tried to contact me a few times in those first months, emails from new addresses that made it past my filters. A letter delivered to my office. Flowers sent to my house with a card that said, "I'm sorry." I threw away the flowers, forwarded the emails to Heather for the restraining order file, shredded the letter without reading it. I'd meant what I told him in that text. I'd done what I had to do. There was nothing left to say. His life fell apart systematically. The criminal charges stuck. He ended up pleading guilty to wire fraud and tax evasion, accepting probation and community service. His tech career was finished. Last I heard through mutual acquaintances, he was working in sales at a mid-level insurance company in New Hampshire, living in a rented apartment, driving a 10-year-old car. Tiffany left Massachusetts entirely, moved to Arizona or Nevada, somewhere far from the wreckage. I stayed in our Beacon Hill townhouse. It felt different now, lighter. I renovated Brandon's office, turned it into a study where I practiced my Italian and read books and planned campaigns. The lock on the filing cabinet became a planter for herbs. A year after the divorce, I went on a date. An architect I'd met through work who made me laugh and ask questions about my life, like the answers actually mattered. It didn't turn into anything serious, but it reminded me that I could be seen as a whole person again. That romance didn't have to feel like erasure. I made new friends, women from my team, clients I connected with, people in my building I'd never talked to when I was married because I'd been too busy being invisible. They saw me as Amanda the marketing director, Amanda the Italian speaker, Amanda who made things happen. Not Amanda the simple wife, not Amanda the decorative furniture, just Amanda. The transformation Mr. Rossi had predicted wasn't dramatic. There was no single moment where I woke up different. It was accumulation, confidence built from small victories, boundaries established and maintained, learning to value my own judgment over someone else's dismissal. I thought sometimes about that dinner in the North End, about sitting there hearing Brandon describe me as simple while I understood every word, about the choice to stay silent in that moment, to wait, to plan, to act strategically rather than emotionally. People asked sometimes if I regretted not confronting him immediately, if I wished I'd thrown wine in his face, made a scene, told Mr. Rossi right then what Brandon had said. I didn't regret it. That silence had been powerful. It had given me time to gather evidence, to build an airtight case, to ensure Brandon faced actual consequences rather than just momentary embarrassment. The Italian language had given me a secret weapon, yes, but the real weapon had been patience, the willingness to feel pain without reacting immediately, to turn betrayal into strategy. I still take Italian lessons, not because I need them professionally anymore, but because the language represents something important to me now. It's a reminder that growth happens in private, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is learn something new while the world assumes you're staying the same. On a warm afternoon in late spring, 18 months after that dinner, Mr. Rossi visited the Boston office. We had lunch at a different restaurant, one with a view of the Common. We discussed expansion plans, quarterly numbers, the success of our campaigns. Then he asked in Italian if I was happy. The question caught me off guard. Happy felt like such a simple word for the complexity of what I'd been through, but I thought about my work, my team, my renovated house, the way I walked through the world now without constantly calculating whether I was being too much or not enough. I told him yes. I was happy. He smiled and raised his glass. He said I deserved it, that he'd watched me build something remarkable from the ruins of what Brandon had tried to destroy. I raised my glass too, but I corrected him gently. I hadn't built something from ruins. I'd discovered what was already there. The strength, the intelligence, the capability. It had always existed. Brandon's betrayal had just finally given me permission to stop hiding it. That's the thing they don't tell you about survival. It's not about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before someone convinced you to be small. Before we left the restaurant, Mr. Rossi asked if I'd ever told Brandon that I understood Italian, if I'd ever given him the satisfaction of knowing what had really happened that night. I said no. As far as Brandon knew, I'd just been lucky, that someone had tipped me off or I'd found something by accident. He'd never understood that I'd heard every word, that his contempt had been delivered directly to my ears in a language he thought was his secret code. Mr. Rossi laughed. He said that was perfect, that Brandon would spend the rest of his life wondering how I'd known, never realizing he'd told me himself. I thought about that as I drove back to the office, about Brandon somewhere in New Hampshire, still believing I'd been too simple to understand, still not realizing that his greatest failure hadn't been the fraud or the affair. It had been underestimating his wife. I've been asked to share this story because apparently it's resonated with a lot of people. If you're watching from Portland or Phoenix or wherever you are, thank you for listening all the way through. If any part of this connected with you, if you've ever felt dismissed or small or invisible, I want you to know something. You're not. You're learning, you're watching, you're getting ready. And when the time comes, you'll know exactly what to do. If you want to follow more stories like this one, hit that subscribe button. You never know when you might need to remember that patience is the weapon of the strong.